The studio lights were bright enough to hide a man's fear. Millions of Americans were watching that night. The band had just finished playing. The audience was laughing. Cameras were moving like silent shadows across the stage of The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson. And sitting calmly in his chair, with a glass in his hand and that effortless smile on his face, was Dean Martin. To the world, Dean was always relaxed. Always joking. Always untouchable. Johnny Carson leaned back in his chair, smiling at the crowd. He had done this thousands of times before. He controlled the rhythm of the room. He knew how to turn silence into laughter and tension into applause. But what happened that night was different. Very different. The setup, the interview began normally. Johnny teased Dean about his movies, about his music, about his legendary laid-back style. The audience roared when Dean responded with smooth, playful one-liners. He made everything look easy. Johnny laughed harder than anyone. But behind the laughter, something felt different. Dean wasn't performing in the usual way. His jokes were slower. His eyes were more focused. Instead of just entertaining, he was watching. Watching Johnny. The camera zoomed in. The applause faded. Dean leaned forward slightly. And then he asked a question no one expected. "Johnny," he said calmly, "when was the last time you were truly happy?" The audience laughed at first. They thought it was another setup for a joke. Johnny smiled automatically. But Dean didn't smile back. The silence, for the first time in years, Johnny Carson had no punchline. The crowd slowly quieted. The band stopped moving. Johnny adjusted his tie. He tried to respond with humor. "Well, Dean, I'm happy right now. I've got you here," he said lightly. The audience chuckled. Dean nodded, but his expression stayed steady. "No," he said gently. "I mean really happy. Not the show. Not the laughs. Just you." The air shifted. Millions watching at home felt it. Johnny blinked. No one asked him that. Not on live television. Not in front of cameras. Not in front of millions. Johnny was the one who asked questions. He was never the one being exposed. The weight behind the smile. What people didn't know that night was that Johnny had been carrying pressure for years. Hosting the biggest late-night show in America meant constant perfection. Ratings. Headlines. Expectations. Every night he had to be sharp. Witty. Unbreakable. He couldn't show weakness. Dean knew that world too. He knew the cost of being the funny one. He knew what it meant to smile while hiding exhaustion. The audience waited. Johnny tried to speak, but his voice came out softer than usual. "Well, I suppose happiness is complicated," he said. It wasn't a joke. It was real. Dean gently placed his glass on the table. "That's not what I asked." The collapse, the tension became visible. Johnny's smile faded completely. He looked down at his desk. For a brief second, he forgot about the cameras. Millions were watching. But suddenly, that didn't matter. His shoulders dropped. And in front of America, Johnny Carson stopped performing. His voice cracked slightly. "You ever feel like," he said slowly, "if you stop making people laugh, they won't stay?" The audience gasped. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't staged. It was honest. Dean leaned back, not in victory but in understanding. "I think," Dean replied quietly, "the people who matter stay when you're not funny." There was no laughter. Only silence. Johnny wiped his eye quickly, trying to recover. But the moment had already happened. For the first time in years, Johnny Carson didn't look like the king of late night. He looked human. And that honesty hit harder than any joke ever could. Why, Dean asked later. People would ask why Dean did it. Why risk such a heavy moment on live television? The truth was simple. Dean had seen something before the show started. Backstage, he noticed Johnny sitting alone in his dressing room. Not reading jokes. Not practicing lines. Just staring at the mirror. Dean recognized that look. The look of a man who was tired of pretending. Dean didn't want to embarrass him. He wanted to free him. Sometimes the strongest act of kindness is asking a question no one else dares to ask. The turning point. Johnny took a deep breath. He looked at Dean, then at the audience. "I guess I don't know the answer," he admitted. And that confession did something powerful. The audience didn't leave. They didn't judge. Instead, they applauded. Not because it was funny, but because it was brave. Dean smiled softly. "There you go," he said. "That's the real show." The band slowly began to play again. Johnny straightened up, but something had changed. He wasn't hiding anymore. After the cameras, when the show ended, the applause continued longer than usual. Backstage, Johnny approached Dean quietly. "You didn't have to do that," Johnny said. Dean shrugged. "Yeah," he replied. "But maybe you did." They both smiled. Not as performers, but as two men who understood the pressure of fame. The lesson that night wasn't remembered for jokes. It was remembered for truth. Millions saw that even the strongest personalities can feel fragile. Even the funniest man in America can feel alone. And sometimes, all it takes is one honest question to break a wall built over years. Dean Martin didn't make Johnny Carson collapse physically. He made him collapse emotionally. He made him drop the mask. And in doing so, he gave millions of viewers permission to drop theirs too. The morning after the broadcast of The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson felt strangely quiet. There were no headlines about scandal. No controversy. No dramatic backlash. Instead, there was something unusual. Respect. Viewers who had watched Johnny Carson every night for years saw a different side of him. Not the sharp host with perfect timing. Not the man with the quick comeback. They saw a human being who hesitated, who searched for words, who admitted he did not have all the answers. Inside his office that morning, Johnny sat alone again. But this time, he was not staring at his reflection in confusion. He was thinking about the silence that followed the question asked by Dean Martin. "When was the last time you were truly happy?" The question echoed louder than the applause ever had. For years, Johnny had measured his life in ratings, reviews, and laughs per minute. Success was numbers. Approval was volume. But that brief emotional pause on live television forced him to confront something deeper. He had mastered the art of entertaining others, yet rarely paused to understand himself. Later that week, the production team noticed small changes. Johnny arrived earlier than usual. He spent less time rehearsing jokes and more time talking with the writers. Instead of demanding sharper punchlines, he asked about their families, their weekends, their lives outside the studio. It surprised everyone. One afternoon, during a break in rehearsal, Johnny walked onto the empty stage. The chairs were perfectly placed. The desk polished. The lights dim. He sat in his seat and looked out at the rows of silent seats. For years, that stage had felt like armor. Behind the desk, he was untouchable. But now he understood something important. The desk was not protection. It was distance. That realization was uncomfortable. A few nights later, during another live show, something different happened again. In the middle of a monologue, Johnny paused after a joke. The laughter came, but he did not immediately move on. He looked at the audience and said calmly, "You know, sometimes we laugh because it's easier than explaining how we feel." The room grew still. It was not heavy like the night Dean had asked his question. It was reflective. Thoughtful. From that point forward, the tone of the show subtly shifted. The humor remained sharp. The timing remained perfect. But there were more real conversations. When guests spoke about struggles, Johnny listened more carefully. He allowed silence to exist. He stopped rushing to cover every serious moment with a joke. Privately, he called Dean a week after the broadcast. "I've been thinking about what you said," Johnny admitted. Dean's voice, steady and relaxed, responded, "That's good. Thinking is better than pretending." They did not speak long. They did not need to. The impact of that night spread beyond the studio walls. Letters poured in from viewers. Many thanked Johnny for showing vulnerability. Some admitted they were facing their own quiet battles. Others said seeing him pause gave them courage to slow down in their own lives. Johnny read those letters personally. One note from a school teacher stood out. She wrote that her students always saw famous people as perfect. But watching Johnny struggle for words showed them that strength includes honesty. That message stayed with him. Gradually, Johnny began protecting something he had ignored before, his personal time. He reduced unnecessary appearances. He chose meaningful interviews over sensational ones. He understood that constant performance without reflection leads to emptiness. The transformation was not dramatic. There were no public announcements. No speeches about change. It was subtle and steady. The man who once feared that people would leave if he stopped making them laugh discovered the opposite. When he allowed himself to be real, the connection grew stronger. Meanwhile, Dean continued appearing as the effortless entertainer the world adored. But those who knew him understood something deeper. He believed in timing not just in comedy, but in life. That night, he had chosen the perfect moment to ask the one question no one else would dare to ask on live television. It was not designed to embarrass. It was designed to awaken. Months later, during another appearance, Johnny welcomed Dean back with a smile that felt different. Stronger, lighter. Before the cameras rolled, Johnny leaned toward him and quietly said, "I think I finally have an answer." Dean simply nodded. The audience never heard what that answer was. It did not need to be public. What mattered was that Johnny was no longer afraid of the question. The night millions witnessed what looked like a collapse was, in truth, a beginning. Not a fall from power, but a step toward balance. And sometimes, the most powerful moments in television history are not the loudest ones. They are the quiet questions that force a man to face himself. Weeks turned into months after that unforgettable night on The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson. The headlines had faded. The ratings remained strong. On the surface, everything looked the same. But inside, something had shifted. Johnny Carson no longer viewed the stage as a shield. He began to see it as a bridge. One evening, during a quiet rehearsal, Johnny asked the studio crew to dim the lights earlier than usual. He stood alone at center stage and looked at the empty chairs. He remembered the night Dean Martin had asked that unexpected question. He realized something important. The collapse people talked about was not weakness, it was release. For years, Johnny had carried the silent pressure of being America's nightly comfort. Viewers ended their day with him. He was expected to be sharp, calm, and always in control. That responsibility created an invisible wall around him. The wall kept criticism out, but it also kept honesty in. After that broadcast, Johnny began allowing himself moments of stillness. During interviews, he stopped interrupting guests for the sake of rhythm. When someone shared a personal struggle, he let the silence breathe. He learned that silence, when handled with care, could be more powerful than laughter. The writers noticed another change. Johnny asked for fewer easy jokes and more thoughtful setups. He wanted humor that connected, not just distracted. He still loved timing and wit. But he no longer feared moments that were not perfectly polished. Behind the scenes, his leadership softened. Instead of staying isolated in his office between segments, he walked through the studio hallways. He asked technicians how long they had been working in television. He listened to their stories. Some were surprised. 4 years. They had admired him from a distance. Now the distance was shrinking. One night, a young guest appeared on the show, visibly nervous. In the past, Johnny might have teased him lightly to loosen the mood. This time, he leaned forward and said quietly, "Take your time." There's no rush. The audience sensed it immediately. The laughter felt warmer. The atmosphere felt safer. The influence of that earlier conversation with Dean continued to guide him. Dean had not offered advice or delivered a speech. He had simply asked a question that required courage to answer. Johnny began asking himself questions off camera. What brings peace beyond applause? Who am I when the lights are off? What do I want to leave behind besides ratings? These reflections did not change him overnight, but they reshaped his priorities. He started spending more evenings away from social events. He valued close friendships more deeply. Success was no longer defined only by numbers. It was measured by balance. Meanwhile, Dean watched quietly from a distance. He never mentioned the incident publicly. He never took credit for the impact. That was his style. He understood that real influence does not demand attention. Months later, during a casual backstage conversation, Johnny finally spoke openly. You knew exactly what you were doing that night, Johnny said. Dean smiled in that calm, effortless way. I knew you were ready, he replied. That answer stayed with Johnny. Ready. Perhaps the moment would have failed if it had happened years earlier. Perhaps he would have deflected with humor and moved on. But that night, something inside him had been prepared for honesty. As time passed, viewers noticed a deeper tone in certain interviews. Not heavy. Not dramatic. Just more human. When guests spoke about failure or doubt, Johnny related not as a performer, but as a person. The show remained successful. The laughter remained strong. But now it carried weight. It was no longer just entertainment. It was connection. The so-called collapse in front of millions was, in truth, the moment Johnny Carson reclaimed something he had almost forgotten, himself. Strength is often mistaken for control. But sometimes, strength is the ability to pose in front of millions and admit uncertainty. That night had not damaged his legacy. It strengthened it. And the quiet question asked by Dean Martin continued to echo not as pressure, but as permission. Permission to be real. Years passed, and the moment that once felt risky slowly became part of television history. The night when Dean Martin asked a single, quiet question on The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson was no longer described as a collapse. It was remembered as a turning point. For Johnny Carson, the change was not loud or dramatic. It was steady and intentional. He continued to host with brilliance. His timing remained sharp. His humor remained unmatched. But those who watched closely noticed something deeper in his presence. There was patience in his pauses. There was warmth in his listening. There was a quiet confidence that no longer depended entirely on laughter. As the years moved forward, Johnny began mentoring younger comedians and hosts who visited the show. Many came seeking advice about ratings, career moves, and public image. Johnny often surprised them with a different message. Learn how to sit in silence, he would say. If you're afraid of it, you'll spend your life running from yourself. He never mentioned that this lesson had been born from a question asked live in front of millions. He did not need to. The experience had already shaped him. Off camera, he became more protective of his inner world. He valued privacy, reflection, and authenticity. Fame no longer defined him. It was something he worked with, not something he hid behind. Meanwhile, Dean continued living in his effortless style. He never publicly spoke about that night in detail. He did not turn it into a story for interviews or headlines. To him, it had been a simple act between two men who understood pressure. But those close to both men understood the deeper truth. Dean had not exposed Johnny. He had trusted him. There is a difference. Exposing someone creates humiliation. Trusting someone with a hard question creates growth. As Johnny approached the later years of his career, retrospectives and documentaries often revisited iconic television moments. The clip from that night would occasionally surface. Viewers watching years later could still feel the shift in energy. They could see the hesitation in Johnny's eyes, the steady calm in Dean's posture, and the silence that filled the studio. What they were really witnessing was not weakness. They were witnessing courage. Courage is rarely loud. It does not always come with dramatic speeches or applause. Sometimes it looks like a man sitting behind a desk, admitting he does not have a simple answer. In private conversations near the end of his career, Johnny once reflected on longevity in television. He said success comes from talent and timing, but respect comes from honesty. Without honesty, even the brightest spotlight eventually feels empty. The night of that question had given him something greater than a memorable broadcast. It had given him balance. When he finally stepped away from the stage years later, the audience did not just remember the jokes. They remembered the man. They remembered how he made them feel not only through laughter, but through sincerity. Dean's question had not caused a fall. It had revealed strength. And that is the final lesson of the story. Sometimes the most powerful act is not delivering a perfect line. It is asking a simple, direct question at the right time. A question that cuts through noise, ego, and performance. In a world built on entertainment, two legends reminded millions of viewers of something deeper. Fame fades, applause ends, and shows eventually close. But honesty leaves a legacy. And all it took to begin that legacy was one quiet moment, one steady voice, and one honest question asked under bright studio lights.